Hey reader, this is Centaur here, and today we're starting a new series that we intend to continue. This is a 7-part series that I will be doing talking about strategy and tactics for transports of various kinds. In my opinion, there are 7 ways to approach moving men swiftly in bolt action, various different ways to transport them. And so we're going to be going through those. And today we're just going to be talking about the first category, and that is what has been termed the Russian doll approach. Now, to give everybody an idea of where we're going in this series, we're going to start by looking at the Russian doll, and you are here, okay, here at the very start. After that, we're going to talk about the dropship, tactical or surgical transports, the gun truck, cover transports, faux transports, and the decision to move your men across the board without transports and efficient, effective ways to do that. So if you have thoughts on like, well, but what if you do this, right? When we're talking about Russian doll, what about putting a 10-man squad inside that transport instead of a bunch of smaller squads? Don't worry, that's coming up in the dropship episode. Okay, so we're not going to talk about any of those other things. Instead, these are each being grouped from a strategic level at what is the reason why you are paying points for a thing, whatever that thing is that you will need in order to get your men across the board. And then, having determined that that's strategically how you want to go about moving your men, we're going to move into a tactical discussion, more or less the same for all 7 of these, as to how to practically get your value out of it. Okay, so there is going to be quite a bit of repetition in the latter half of all of these episodes, just because very often the goal of a transport is get the guys in, get them right where they need to be so they can jump out very quickly and do their job, right? And then from there, we're just going to have some slight tweaks and differences because of whatever the strategic decision was for what transports we're going to take. So with no further ado, let's talk about the Russian doll. Now, I have to give a hat tip to Bo Mortensen on this. He's the first guy that I heard say, the term Russian doll as regards how to approach transports. And so I'm sure this isn't like an original thinking. A lot of people have done this, but it's a relatively simple process. In this case, and you'll see it right there in the picture to the right, if you put multiple units in a single transport and they all jump out, and oftentimes this is going to include an officer, that is what we mean when we talk about a Russian doll transport, where much like a Russian doll, you open it up and there's another doll inside. You open now and there's another one inside, and it just pop, 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 all of these until you get to a really, really tiny one, right? Well, in this thinking, it's that we have multiple units that are inside, typically with an officer, so you can take advantage of the snap to snap the vehicle, and then later on snap the men and get them out as well. It's relatively effective, quite efficient, and you'll find that a lot of people use this, especially with anti-tank and flamethrower style teams. But there are technically other ways to do it, and oftentimes they'll use larger transports, but not always. So as one example, you can do a Bren carrier Russian doll quite effectively. It only has a transport capacity of 5, but if those 5 men are a platoon commander, simple lieutenant, or something like that, will do the job, and you include a flamethrower team and a Piat team in there, you have a 1-man officer section along with a 2-man flamethrower team and a 2-man anti-tank team, and all 5 of those fit in the Bren carrier. And then the Bren carrier moves up, possibly commanded by the officer with a snap 2 or something like that. And then on the same turn, the Piat or the flamethrower, whoever's in proper range that you estimate beforehand, because of course no pre-measuring, one of those jumps out and can immediately start acting even as part of that same drawing of order dice, so to speak, right? Because of the snap 2 option. You can also see this on, other transports. More commonly, you'll see them on things that have a capacity of 8 to 12. So you're going to see a lot of those over the course of this video. So for example, over here on the right-hand side, we have an M3 half-track, and he's carrying, a platoon commander or possibly even a company commander along with 5 bazooka teams, right? This is probably taken by taking a rifle platoon, a heavy weapons platoon, and maybe a recce platoon. Or if you're using the new Armies of the United States book, maybe you took a mechanized infantry section, which allows you to take another bazooka. So maybe you only had to take a rifle team and a heavy weapons team, right? Or heck, maybe you took 4 armored, mechanized infantry or something like that in your rifle platoon, and each of those gave you 1 extra bazooka, and then you get the extra bazooka for being a rifle platoon, and you get 5. The point is, of course, ultimately that you have an awful lot of firepower with a lot of activations in a small space. You can go even bigger than this, interestingly enough. I mean, you could have a Russian doll that has like 8 or 9 units in it. So if you have an LVT, right? We've got this big old, amphibious tank, effectively, with a bunch of machine guns on it that moves up, but it still has transport capacity. So it starts dropping out like a lieutenant and a flamethrower team and a bazooka team and maybe like a U.S. Marine Corps dog team and like a couple of Marine squads, right? You're just throwing a ton of stuff at the wall. Everybody's disembarking and unloading from this thing, right? You can do even more with boats. Several of the landing crafts, like the LCP, for example, they'll have capacity for like up to 36 guys, or they'll allow you to take like over a dozen guys and a Jeep. And in this case, you can literally do a Russian doll because there's nothing that says the Jeep has to be empty. So you could have the Jeep with maybe like an officer and a bazooka or something like that inside. Maybe put a company commander inside so that the company commander can be assigned an order and he can snap the landing craft because it's within range of the soft skin vehicle, the Jeep, the bazooka team, and maybe another infantry section that's inside to help give some supporting fire once you've jumped out with the Jeep and done your job. And then you could snap everybody else after that with, say, a platoon commander that's still inside, right? Or something. You get the point, right? Is that you could have thing comes out, unloads a bunch of stuff, and in one case, even that Jeep continues moving and then has the ability to unload a bunch of stuff. All kinds and kinds of shenanigans here. I'll be honest, some of it can get pretty crazy. But the trade-offs, as we'll see, there are disadvantages to doing this. But there is quite a bit of leeway here, a lot of things to think about. Don't just think of it as a large transport with multiple units in it. Like, it could be a small one. It could be a boat. There's a lot of different things you can do with Russian doll theory. So what are the advantages to doing this? Well, for starters, in general, there's a point savings in taking one larger transport over and against two smaller transports, right? So in the case of, say, two heavy fuel cars, those are going to cost more than one 12-man capacity truck, right? And there's an honest reason for that and a good reason for that, which is that you get more order dice if you take multiple transports, right? So there should be a trade-off. Also, that means, technically speaking, people need to roll to hit and they need to roll to wound against more stuff in order to try to remove the transporting threats if there are multiples. So the result is you tend to save points. Obviously, it'll depend on, the level of resilience that you're purchasing. A 12-man, 7+ transport is going to cost more than two soft-skinned 6-man transports. But as long as you're looking at comparable defenses, you're going to save points. The second reason, and this is especially true if you have an officer in the squad, is it allows you to have force concentration. Now, there are ways to optimize or not optimize this, right? So in the case of the half-track example we used earlier, you don't have an officer who can snap the half-track and all 5 of the bazooka teams at once. Can't happen, okay? So also, there are ways to better economize it to make sure that there's less chance of people catching your men in the transport and either pinning them or possibly even removing them if they can destroy the transport. Assaulting it, assaulting the transport in order to get the guys out. There's a lot of different ways you can remove units without them really getting a chance to do anything. And so in optimized Russian doll, we'll think within the context of how many units can I snap to, and they will include an officer in there. So for example, the example over there on the right has an 8-man capacity M3 White Scout car that's in progress right now. One of the things I'm currently working on for my Americans and my Dutch forces, which is why I haven't put any decals on it yet, because I'm not sure whether I want to do that. But in this case, he's carrying an inexperienced company commander who can snap 4 units. And the plan is for those 4 units to be the M3 White Scout car getting an advance. He'll probably give himself an advance so he can jump out and shoot his submachine gun. And then he'll assign the other 3 orders to the 3 bazooka teams who will also all get advance actions. And we'll be seeing these guys as an example of what a Russian doll can do in our tactical discussion below. They will be our example case for looking at it. This allows you to really take advantage of the tools that you have, right? Because before an enemy has a chance to shoot back at any of these bazooka teams, they could all be jumping out, they could all be shooting at something, and if it's something damage IU 8 or lower, damage IU even 9 or lower, you got a pretty good chance of hitting with at least one of these bazookas, and you got a pretty good chance of doing actual damage with the bazooka. So you're at least doing another pin and they're going down, possibly something better. So on the whole, pretty effective. As a Russian doll, you can throw out there effectively a bomb to just blow up somebody else's armor. Another reason to do Russian doll theory is that, frankly, it's cheaper to do it this way. Not from just a points perspective, but from an actual physical cash perspective, right? If you own a 3D printer, whether you're buying official models from Warlord, whether you're buying super cheap trucks on Amazon or AliExpress or wherever it is that you go for your super cheap transports, Uh, in general, if you only have to buy one, it's going to be cheaper than if you have to buy four, right? And so by running Russian doll theory as a thinking, you only need one, maybe two transports for your entire army. And that will save you quite a few points down the line. From a dollars, cut that part. And that will save you an awful lot of money down the line. Another advantage is it does help you out with morale bubble effects. So if you want to make sure that units who would generally have to stay more than an inch apart, if you want to maximize the number of models that were within the range of a morale bonus, one of the easiest ways is to put them all in a transport, because then the transport can hold a bunch of people who probably actually have a larger footprint than the transport, to be honest. And so the result is that you can fit more guys within range of your morale bubble, which is quite useful in case you're running an army that's lower on veterancy and you're a little worried about them activating reliably and you want to keep them from running away. It's nice when you can keep them within range of a +2 or +4 morale bubble. And then finally, another reason to run smaller numbers of transports instead of larger numbers is that transports are relatively easy to remove unless you're running something like a kangaroo. In which case, you're denying your opponent potential points in a kill points mission. So if they're getting one victory point for each order dice that they remove, running less order dice that are not as durable or not as resilient is generally going to remove some potential for your opponent to get order dice out of you. And that can be advantageous. But there are some disadvantages. For starters, you do have less order dice in the pool, right? So, on the one hand, yes, you're removing order dice that may not contribute that much to the overall victory. Definitely not going to contribute that much to enemy force removal. But at the same time, you might also just have less order dice, which means you're less likely to get the draw on a turn where it really matters. In addition, you're committing more commitment to one transport. If something happens to that, this is a classic all of your eggs in one basket sort of thing, or all of your eggs in two baskets sort of thing, where if something happens to the transport because a unit's on ambush or you didn't anticipate how fast an armored car on a road can travel to get to point blank range and shoot you up with an autocannon against a soft skin transport, all of that is really bad, right? And so the result is that you might end up losing quite a bit all at once if catastrophe strikes. You could also see an example where you have a heightened AWOL risk in reserve. And so for an example of that, this was a mistake I made when I was new to bolt action. I was first playing around with transports. I took an inexperienced truck in second edition because it saved me quite a few points to take it inexperienced. And this was before we got the pintle mounted machine guns on everything sort of thing. So I was like, okay, well, I just need to transport up 2 5-man submachine gun squads. And I was like, okay, and I'm gonna throw a second lieutenant in there. Had to take it regular because Germans. And so I had, as you can see from this picture, a lot of points all tied up. I mean, all told, this was like almost 300 points. That was all tied up in, no, it was like 200 points, all tied up in a single model, the transport, trying to move onto the board. And I only needed like an 8 to bring it on, right? Because it would have been 9, but it was coming in from reserve, so it took the -1. So it went from 8 base to 9 because of the lieutenant, back down to 8. And so on turn 2, I try to bring it in because I'm like, okay, now I know where the opponent's riflemen and their machine gun tanks and stuff like that are located. I'm going to bring these guys on where it's a lot safer. And I failed the first check. And I failed the second check. And by turn 5, we came on. But by turn 5, since this was like a quarter of my army, fifth of my army or whatever, like I had almost nothing left, right? And so sure enough, my opponent had a whole bunch of stuff ready to go, just waiting. I think on turn 5 when we came on, he had like 5 units on ambush, just waiting for my truck to come onto the board. And sure enough, me being a good sport, knowing this was going to end badly, I still just played through it because I'm like, you know what? Hey, you played the game correctly. I'm going to give you an opportunity to showcase how well you played. And so I came on with the truck. The truck got destroyed. Thankfully, they were veterans, so I didn't lose that many dudes coming out. But obviously, we didn't really do anything over the course of the game, and that was it. So you run a risk if you have this Russian doll kept in reserve or in outflank for that matter. You run a risk of them being absent without leave, and that can potentially cost you the game. So you have to be really careful about how you use these. And in general, as you'll see later, I just wouldn't recommend putting them in reserve or in outflank because you've put such an investment in this. There's also a fear of pin escalation threats. So this is where, because of the rule that when a unit is in a transport, if the transport suffers a pin, all of the units in the transport also suffer an equal number of pins from that attack. So by even shooting at this truck with a rifle, even if I don't wound it, even if I don't, potentially cause damage to it, I have dealt a pin to the truck, I've dealt a pin to the officer, and I've dealt a pin to each of the squads. It's 4 pins. If it does D2 pins or D3 pins, heaven forbid you get hit by a Sturmtiger and you're taking D6 pins in 3rd edition. You could end up with one activation for your opponent effectively neutralizing every activation that's in this truck. Because the chance that they're going to pass, even with a company commander benefit, could be really, really bad. Okay, so toward that end, you just have to be a little bit careful. Again, this is going to go into the tactical play to make sure that we know this, but we need to know this going into it. You are risking a lot of pins being generated very quickly. There are also generally higher casualties if the transport's destroyed because, of course, you're rolling D6 hits for each unit that's coming out of it. You're not rolling D6 hits split between the units that are inside of it. And so you could be rolling, in the case of this Russian doll on the right, 3d6, one for each of these units, and then rolling wounds against them, right? The infantry sections with the submachine guns, they'll probably be fine. They might lose a guy if they're veteran, which these guys are. But the officer's in trouble, right, on his own, especially because you don't tend to take those officers as veteran if you're planning on just putting them in a transport. So, these are things you need to consider. You'll also obviously want to look out for potential kill point concession. That is to say, while yes, you have less kill points from transports, you might make it easier for them to remove the units that are in said transport because they're generally smaller, right? You're running maybe a 5 or 6 man tops in a Russian doll. You're not generally running larger than a 5 or 6 man squad, which means it might be easier to remove that squad than it would be for, say, a 9 to 10 man squad, which we'll be looking at when we talk about dropships next week. But just suffice it to say, that is probably the biggest ones. Oh, there is one final thing. In general, the vehicle that you use for a Russian doll tends to have a larger footprint than other transports. Okay, they tend to be on the larger side. Not always true, but that is something that you might need to consider. Okay, as one example of how it might be smaller, you'll notice there on the right-hand side as we're looking at what transports should you choose. A Russian doll can technically have a transport capacity of 3. In this case, we have this is actually a Polski Fiat. This is a Polish civilian car. It isn't like a Kuragane or something like that because I don't own any of those for the Imperial Japanese Army. But as you'll notice there for the IJA, you could run an officer who could then be carrying around with him 2 lunge mine anti-tank teams. Okay, you guys know what I'm talking about. We're not going to say it because YouTube. But suffice it to say, that is technically a Russian doll. Right? And it's an extremely cheap Russian doll, especially if you're purchasing the 2 dudes inside inexperienced. You're purchasing the officer regular. You're purchasing the truck, say, inexperienced because you've got the officer morale bonus. That whole investment is under 75 points, right? The whole thing. So, it doesn't have to cost a lot from a points perspective or from a model perspective to have a Russian doll. You can run it as small as 3. Most, I'm going to guess, are somewhere between 6 to 12, with the 8 to 12 being the most common area, I think, because you can fit in more substantial stuff or more substantial numbers around a company commander. Okay. Another thing worth considering is, does it have to be an armored transport or can it be soft-skinned? Armored transports obviously come with the benefit of the fact that they don't tend to cough up as many points to the enemy because they are harder to destroy. You can't destroy them with a rifle. You can't destroy them with a machine gun team. You have to destroy them with a heavy weapon, and that is quite convenient. Even if they're suffering pins from these things because they're open-topped, a lot of armored transports are. If you have an officer in there, maybe that's okay, right? So, it's just a consideration, like, do you need armor? Or are you planning on rushing people up, dropping them off very quickly, and boogieing out of there before you get into trouble? If that's the case, you might be able to get away with a soft skin vehicle, which does save you quite a few points, about 15 to 20 points on average. So a thing to consider, right? Just a thing to think about. You don't necessarily have to take it heavily armored, even if you put a substantial investment in there. The consideration of open top versus closed is an important one for armored stuff. So if you're going soft skin, it doesn't matter. You never have open topped soft skin vehicles. It's just always the same at soft skin. But if you are taking an armored one, it could be advantageous to try to take it closed. Now, I'll be honest, these are pretty rare. You have things like the VUDB Berlier for France and Belgium. You have a can be closed-topped transport for Poland, depending on which edition you're playing, though Do they have really good options to put in said transport as a Russian doll theory? That's an excellent question, because they don't get like really, really incredible anti-tank options. They don't get access to flamethrowers. Squads tend to be pretty large. So, like there are things to think about. But if you do fully button it up, it is very safe to transport men in there because they have to devote heavy weapons to even try to pin it, let alone destroy it, which means there's a lot of stuff on the board that you're not nearly as worried about. The question of whether or not you want it to be mobile in rough terrain is an important question, right? If you plan to be able to move it through, woods, through ruins, through water, in the case of, is it worth paying a couple extra points to convert a truck into a ducky, for example, for the United States? It might be. It might be, right? Taking something that's a little more amphibious could be advantageous depending on what you think you may be playing on. The question of, do you want to get double movement on roads? So favoring a half track or a wheeled option over and against a treaded option. You might end up paying more points, potentially, depending on what it is that you're taking. It can be pretty rare to get armored wheeled transports. They do exist. The Berlier that we talked about before is one of those. But if it's important for you to be able to move up really, really fast, maybe because you're using lunge mine guys or you're using flamethrowers, right, or Piats, or something that has a very short range, right, something that needs to get in close, you might need that. And so as much as you may want to take a Bren carrier, you might be using a heavy field car, right? There's just a lot of questions that you need to ask from a what do you actually need. And of course, the last question that I think is worth asking once you've kind of solidified on the choice you want is veterancy. If you're putting an officer in it, is inexperienced enough? Because it's not going to improve the resilience of the transport. It's just going to determine how active and how easy it is for the transport to do what you want, right? You could consider taking it regular, especially if you're planning on putting it in an outflank or in a reserve capacity, because you might want that higher level just for a better margin of error. You might even consider taking it veteran because maybe you know that you can't fit an officer. Maybe you're running so many bazookas and so many jeeps that you decide, you know what, I actually can't take an officer in every single one of these. I'm going to have one odd man out. Maybe that one's taken veteran. Okay, a lot of things to consider as you're looking at what kind of transport do you want to choose. So now that we've chosen our transport, we're going to talk about deploying it. So in this case, over here on the right-hand side, we have our case study. This is a work in progress board that I'm currently working on for a kind of Tunisian, North African sort of build. And in this case, the Americans are deploying here on the bottom side, and then the Germans will be deployed on the top side. But just to kind of show you what it could look like, about 12 inches up, we decided to deploy the transport because transport's going to be filled with our one company commander and our 3 bazooka teams. This means I want them to get up pretty much as far up as they possibly can. And so we're going to start by making sure that when we deploy it, we're deploying it in cover. Okay. From every reasonable angle up until you hit about the middle of the board, there is a building or a ruin that is blocking line of sight to the transport. And this is very helpful. You just get right down there to the level of the table as best you can. Look around, just pan around, and just make sure that as far as you can see, you're going to have something covering something, right? You could also deploy directly behind a building if you want to. But the big thing to remember is you want to make sure that you have an easy path for getting out. Note that you do have to pivot around your center for every transport if you want to be able to pivot. So you're going to potentially need room to either side. So deploying too far to a board edge could be problematic for getting you to turn. You might need to make sure that you're a little far away from a building in order for you to be able to turn, okay? If you've taken a transport with the recce rule, either because it innately has the recce rule or because you took it as part of a recce platoon and you added the recce rule, make sure you have an option for a recce move or maneuver that is advantageous for you, okay? There's just a lot of stuff when you're thinking about how you first put it down. You want to make sure that you're working towards your own strengths and to your advantage. The second thing to consider is you really don't want to just have one place to place the transport. If there's only one obvious place to place the transport, your opponent might notice that too. And if that's the case, they may plan around it. They may make sure that they've got units, maybe even starting the game on ambush, depending on what their army special rules are. They may be ready for you, and that could be extremely dangerous if you're not careful. So my recommendation is have about 2 to 3 places where you think it would be advantageous to have this. Partially it's going to be due to what you're putting inside. Partially it's going to be decided by the map, okay? But have like 2 to 3 places where you can make sure that you're in good cover, you know that you'll be able to get where you need to go. And in general, you want to deploy the transport last. Since this is something you're putting a lot of eggs in, you want to make sure that this basket is going to be safe. So place as many of your other units as possible and keep the opponent guessing for as long as possible as to where the transport is going. In addition, part of making sure that you deploy this last is make sure that you give down orders to the passengers first. Now, you could do this literally as your first 4 order dice when it comes to deployment. You could just be like, okay, my first one is going to my company commander and he's going down because he's in the transport. Fair enough. That's how it works. And the second one could go to your bazooka team number 1, second one goes to bazooka number 2, and the third one goes to bazooka number 3. I don't tend to do this when I'm doing deployment because I don't know, something about it. I just kind of like my opponent knowing something about what's going on my side of the board. So I will do this for like 1 or 2, especially if mine are the first 2 that are out of the bag. And then at that point, I'll start actually dropping units, right? I'll place the mortar where it's obvious that I was going to place a mortar. I'll place an autocannon or artillery piece of some kind. Looking down a nice long range, row, because it's quite obvious that's where I was going to put that, et cetera, et cetera. And now my opponent has a chance to counter deploy. They feel like it's more sporting. They feel more gentlemanly about it. And later on, I can always go down with those guys once I've got some units on the board to give them an idea of what I will look like. So you got to think through what is it that could go down after you that could complicate your ability to act with the Russian doll. Okay. This also means if you are going to put it in reserves, first of all, I would always include an officer just to make sure it arrives. Again, we don't want that heightened AWOL risk to bite us. The second thing is I would seriously consider taking the transport at regular. This is not only useful in case it has a machine gun or heavy machine gun or other weapon system on it, because you're not getting that -1 to hit, but it's also useful because it allows you to do some better counter deployment because you can come in when you want to. But in addition to that, it means that you know where your opponent's threats are. And not only can you reliably come in, you can now bring it in where you actually need it, right? So if you're loaded up, for example, with bazookas, as these guys are, you may not want to place this until you are absolutely certain you know where your opponent's armor is. Because it's no good if you place it on one side of the board and the enemy armor is on the opposite side, right? Takes away all of the advantage. So holding in reserve could be useful. Just know you are inviting additional risk. You could also outflank a Russian doll. It does mean you generally get to come in a lot closer to the enemy, which could be quite useful. It gives you better flanking potential for removing large amounts of especially softer team weapon style units and other supporting units that are nearer to the back and a little further out toward an edge, which could be quite useful. But it means you're losing turn 1 and turn 2. You don't get a chance to do anything with those, which means the earliest you would start shooting at the enemy would be turn 3. And that's a third of the way through the game. And it's probably more than a third of the way through the turn, time limit, right? Because if you're playing in a timed match and you only have 2 hours or 2.5 hours or 3 hours to play, the first couple turns, since they have the most order dice and the most options available on the table, are generally going to be the longest terms, which means you're losing whatever value you had in that Russian doll transport, and it's typically quite a bit. You're losing it for longer in the game. And maybe that's not advantageous. So in general, I don't tend to outflank Russian dolls, but one could if one wanted to. So now that we've got our unit deployed, we've selected it, we have it on the table, let's talk about the rush. I think the first question we need to ask is, okay, are we doing a run order or are we doing an advance order? In this case, in general, advance tends to be the best option, as long as you can get within range to actually drop the men off. Because the rule in bolt action is a transport that's at a run can't be disembarked. You can't get the men out in the same turn because it's moving too fast, right? They would hurt themselves, they would injure themselves, some of their kit might break or in some way become incapacitated, get lost along the way. There are issues with that. And so because of that, they only allow you to disembark on an advance order or if the transport hasn't moved yet. So toward this end, for our scenario, the M3 White Scout car, looking at it, they're starting on a road. It's a wheeled vehicle, so it gets up to 24 inches with 2 pivots on an advance, which is pretty crazy. And so the commander decides to advance the M3 Scout car. And so it moves from down here where it was hiding up to here, performs pivot number 1, moves up here, and then performs pivot number 2, and that's where it chooses to end. Okay? Since this was activated by the company commander received the order dice. He snaps the 3 bazooka teams and the M3 White Scout car. They can activate in any order. The M3 White Scout car activates first. It jumps over. As soon as it comes out, because there is a machine gun team in the second floor of this building with that window, and there's a mortar team that's up on top of the building, and there's a Stug 3 that's over here in this open area. The M3 White Scout car, when it moves up, it decides to fire its machine gun, its heavy machine gun, at the machine gun team that's in the building. It's getting a 4+ cover save, but one, this was the advantageous way for it to end its move in terms of facings, so that's important. We'll talk about that next. But in addition, it was also the most likely thing to cause threats for these bazooka teams. It knows that it can't protect all of them, and they can't get cover from that machine gun team for everybody once they disembark. So we better start putting some hits, if not wounds, on them just to help pin them down and keep them from hurting us later on down the line. So they landed on advance, and in this case, everybody is advancing together. This then begs the question of distance. Is the advance going to get you the distance so the passengers can actually do stuff on the turn when they exit? This commander assesses that that is probably true, should be able to do stuff, and begins dropping people out. They start off by dropping off the company commander, who ends up moving 6 inches into this ruin over here on his advance. And he also takes a shot over at this machine gun team, shooting at them through the window. We measure it out. It's like 11.5 inches. It is very, very close. But it is technically within range of his submachine gun. And so he starts performing his shots, 4+ to hit, potentially hits, and if nothing else, doing pins to again just help to hold down that machine gun team. From there, they start to drop all of the bazookas. And in this case, the bazooka that's going to be dropped out first is going to be the one that's moving furthest forward. And the reason why is because we want to make sure that we're not firing too close to our other units. So we need to know where those closer units are to make sure we can get everybody advantageously placed. They tuck right in over here along the side of the building. And upon tucking in there, they know that they're going to get cover from the Stug if the Stug is still around and gets really angry at them. They'll also be getting cover from the machine gun team. Obviously no cover from the mortar team, but maybe it's within 12. Who knows? Either way, they are easily within 24 inches of the Stug. So this bazooka is able to do its job. It checks. Then this bazooka team jumps out and makes sure that where it's shooting at, when it's shooting at the Stug, that it's going to be shooting beyond an inch of this unit over here. They're going to be exposed any which way they cut it. But it's okay, because maybe losing the bazooka team after it takes out a Stug, that's a good points trade. Maybe that's okay. Starts firing at it. Play continues. The third bazooka team jumps out, and they're going to jump out behind the scout car. This is designed so that, one, ideally they still have 24 inches. We measured it. It was literally within millimeters of being within 24 inches, but it was still in range. The bazooka team is thinking, well, I want to make sure that I've got cover from the Stug. I want to make sure I've got cover from the machine gun team. So I'm going to park it so that my other guy, my loader, is at least partially obscured by this armored car, this M3 White Scout car. And so since it has a damage value of 7, that's going to be heavy cover for this unit as well. These are the things you have to consider, right? You have to consider, are we still going to be in range? Because if we deploy people, they jump out, they get into an advantageous place, but they can't hit the target. Now our opponent knows what's going on, right? The jig is up. And so potentially problematic issues arise there. So we need to act quickly, but we still need to make sure that we're acting effectively. The next thing to consider is, okay, so with the Officer Snap 2, can we snap the transport and the critical stuff all at once? This reduces the pin chance in the transport because you're not having guys sitting in there after play potentially flips to the opponent. And then maybe they activate something to start shooting at stuff. We want to reduce that increased pin danger. And so we want to make sure we're jumping as many people out of the transport as possible that are important. Okay, if you randomly brought a medic with you and you didn't really care about the medic, if you just had an extra odd man out, you had an extra spot, you wanted to include him just so he'd be with them later, fair enough. But you don't technically need to drop him out first, right? He might be able to wait until later. And then the question of cover. Will they have cover at the end of their activation? Or am I coughing up a potential unit? If I flub really bad, maybe that isn't worth it, right? So do please consider that. Then when we look at like the actual tactics of dropping off the passengers, believe it or not, as you might have noticed, there's a bit of thought about this. So remember, if you can, use a pivot at the very end of your move. If you still have one left available, use one pivot to make sure that you're providing cover for where you want your passengers to be. Now, this gets a little more complicated if there's a gun on the transport, because you might want to use that gun, and if it doesn't have a 360-degree arc of fire, like, say, an M3 half-track does, you might have limited options, right, on where you do this. But since you're probably dropping people, you're probably taking an advance order, and that means you want to make sure you're using that machine gun if you can, because that's part of an advance, if you have one, right? So make sure that you're providing cover for all the friendlies who are behind you. Second question is one of footprint, right? So if units have to be at least 1 inch apart, you have to make sure that you're leaving enough room for them on the board, right? So you have a unit that's tucked in over here. We can't have another bazooka team that's right on them. We have to leave at least 1 inch for them here. And so while, yes, you could technically load up like a 29-man British Bedford QLT truck with like 14 squads, right? And an officer, right? Or something like that. Realistically, are you going to actually have room to get all of those models out? Are you going to have the ability to actually get them to a place where it's not only legal for them to be, but advantageous for them to be? This is an important question. Okay, it could work hypothetically, especially if you have a combination of some people are just running out and some people are advancing out. Okay, but suffice it to say, this is an important question. Footprint, right? How far away do they need to be from each other so that you can shoot past them? How much do they need to be apart from each other for where they end their move? These are the things you have to consider with the Russian doll that you don't really have to consider nearly as much with other styles of transport theory. There's also, of course, the question of cover, right? Which units have to end in cover versus which ones would it be nice? So in this case, it was important that the company commander end in cover for this particular case because he has 42 points. He has an awful lot. He's the guy making sure that even if these guys get fired upon, they will probably still be firing next turn. As soon as that morale bubble disappears, regular or veteran bazookas, if they take enough shots at them, may not be that reliable. They may get hunkered down. And if they get bunkered down, you're not going to be removing that tank asset, right? So you need to make sure which units absolutely have to be in cover, in this case, the company commander, which ones could afford to be left in the open, one bazooka team at least. It's okay if at least one of them is left in the open. Try to make sure as many of them as possible are not in the open, but if one of them is left out, it's okay. And then finally, consider for objectives, can you reach an objective with a single run order? If you can't, or if you'd be just shy, or if you think it's on the edge, maybe it'd be better to advance to cover and then move up to get onto the objective on the following turn. Obviously, if you're down to like the last 5 minutes of the game, that's one thing. But if you're at the last 5 minutes of the game and you still have a Russian doll, I have a lot of questions about why you didn't deploy the doll sooner. Okay? So one of the things we should be asking, though, is yes, I could rush ahead, but am I throwing myself too much into risk? Would it be better for me to wait, be a little more conservative, and launch the bomb more effectively next turn rather than rushing up to just try to quickly get guys onto the objective into range? That way, even if the truck gets blown up, then the guys come out of it and they're still on the objective, right? Like these are the questions that I think are worth asking, and you'll want to consider when it comes to how to actually drop the passengers. And then the final thing we're going to talk about is retreating. At what point is it a good idea to move the transport back? I think this very much depends on the kind of transport you have, right? Because first of all, maybe your transport wants to stand and fight. Things like an M3 White Scout car, the Bren Carrier, the Berlier, they've got weapon systems innately on them. They may also feel comfortable in their damage value of 7 to just stick around and fight, right? Provide pins downrange, if not actual wounds against people. And if you're taking something like a Stummel, which has not only armor, but it has a much bigger, much stronger gun on it, it's not just a machine gun, it's a serious heavy weapon. It very well could be advantageous for you to say, I'm bringing up these Stummels and I'm going to be using them as my Russian dolls. And I'm going to drop a bunch of guys with submachine guns out of these things alongside guys with Panzerschrecks. And we're going to rake the enemy. And this Stummel doesn't run. This Stummel's going to say, right? That's an important question, right? What do they have to offer that will cause them to say, I'm staying up here and I'm not retreating or falling back if I can possibly avoid it? The second thing is if you do have the wrecking maneuver on it, you may not necessarily need to retreat by activating with an order dice. You could do it as a reaction to something. It does mean you'll want to set up for recce after each move order. So when you're considering that final pivot, when you're considering how you're setting yourself up for cover, make sure you've got a line to be able to run, but make sure that you're not going to accidentally run off the table. Right? Things like this are very important in case you fail an order test or things like that. You want to make sure that your transport is nicely situated so that way, if it has to retreat, if it has to back up or remove for any reason, that you have a means for it to be able to do so that's advantageous, but it's not going to run them off an edge. If you have a special rule like turn on the spot or dual direction steering, though dual direction steering is not nearly as common for transports as it is for armored cars. If you have a rule like this that allows you to very, very easily and quite nimbly reverse out of places, that is quite useful and it's good to have. Just keep in mind that none of these vehicles, short of taking them in a recce platoon, can have the recce rule, as I recall. So you know, you're going to have to set up either with extra points or with your own activations to be able to get them out of a tight spot, if that's the case. There's also what I like to call the lateral retreat. The lateral retreat is where I'm not actually retreating the vehicle back toward my main line. I'm retreating it laterally toward another part of the battlefield because I might need to pick up guys from that side to move them elsewhere. This is most common when you have, like, say, a larger squad of like 8 to 9 men jump up onto an objective and they end up taking the objective, but then they come maybe with like an AT rifle team or a mortar team of some kind or something like that, and you can leave them to guard the objective, and you can afford to boogie out the larger squad to continue making it do work for you and get better value for how much you put into it. A lateral retreat to support your other elements across the battlefield is quite advantageous, and Russian dolls tend to have the ability to do this because they tend to have a higher transport capacity, right? You're more likely to be able to fit an 8-man squad into an 8 to 12-man transport than you are a 3-man transport. Technically, advanced section rules, optional rules for having multiple Jeeps or whatever in close proximity to each other to be able to transport larger squads aside for a moment, just raw baked into the rules, core rules that you expect to find in a tournament or competitive setting. Generally speaking, Russian doll style transports tend to be better at doing lateral support. And then the next question is, are you going to need them to pick up a second load? Right? Either because maybe the Russian doll dropped out a bunch of these bazookas, they blew up the Stug, and now they're wasted on this side. Bazookas are fine for attacking buildings in 3rd edition. They were not great at it in 2nd edition. But if your opponent has anything else, if people behind a stone wall, people in a ruin, Bazooka's actually not very good at fighting those, right? So it might be advantageous on the following turn to snap the company commander. Company commander orders an advance to himself, and he gives a snap 2 to all the units that he did before, gives them all advance or run orders, and they all run back into the M3 White Scout car, and then the M3 White Scout car goes last, pivots, and gets out of there. Moves to another spot, right? Maybe we took some pins, fair enough, but if not, we just boogied out of here, and the scout car can still fire on the turn, so we might have even done a pin with that massive set of activations, okay? And that's all we're going to do for talking about transports, okay? A lot of different ways you can do it. Different armies have access to different things. In general, because we have those commonly available vehicles, you can always count on having a 3-man, 6-man heavy fuel car, 8-man light truck, 12-man standard truck style stuff. And you can make them bigger than that, but you can always count on those for soft-skin vehicles. And you can always count on, I want to be careful on this. There are a couple of tows that can take transport capacity. I generally wouldn't do that, but it does sometimes give you access to like a treaded option for getting people through rough terrain because they do also have transport capacity, okay? Because you don't have to hitch an artillery piece to it. You could jump a flamethrower team into a tow that has transport capacity, and you can move off with that, okay? But in general, you do have options for both tracked, typically, and wheeled options. A lot of armies also have half-track options. Armored tends to be a little more sparse. They don't come up nearly as often, but they do exist for a good number of nations. So, did I miss anything? Are there other thoughts from a Russian doll perspective that I should have mentioned? If so, leave them down in the comments below. Next week, we're going to be talking about the drop ship, which is basically the opposite of the Russian doll theory when it comes to theories about transports. I hope that you will join us then. Until then, though, I wish you all the very best in your games, and I will see you next time.